Greetings. Without further ado, I'd like to dive into the first lecture of the semester. Those of you that follow the class closely will inevitably come to the conclusion that the central issue in our class is going to be the concept of American exceptionalism. Now, over the course of the semester, you're going to find that this is going to come to mean many things. Not necessarily different things, but they're going to mean several things all at the same time. As a matter of fact, the first quiz is going to ask you whether or not you feel that America, and that is the United States, is different, an exception, if you will, to the general trend of great civilizations, ancient Rome, ancient China, ancient Azteca, for instance. One of the things that I feel that sets American society apart from other civilizations is there really isn't such a definition as a quote-unquote true American. Now, I know that there are political pundits and talking heads, if you will, that would have you believe otherwise, but if you study history long enough, you'll come to see that there really isn't any such thing as a true definition of an American. What I'd like you to do now, and if you need to, go ahead and put me on pause, but download that PowerPoint lecture in the Week 1 lecture folder. And I want you to go to that second slide. It's a slide entitled, What is an American? Look at all the people on that slide. You've got Crazy Horse, the Native American at the bottom of the screen there. You've got Abraham Lincoln, the top left corner. You've got the Buffalo Soldier, top right corner. Dolores Huerta, the top or the bottom right corner. I think that it's a pretty obvious observation that they're all American. Now, they come from very different walks of life. I think another obvious observation is they're all of different races. The simple fact of the matter is, America is a nation of different races. America is a nation of very different people. I mean, think about this from the perspective of food. I mean, the kind of food that we eat in the South is quite different than the food that they eat in the Northeast, the food that they eat in the Midwest, the food that they eat in the West Coast. Think about dialects. We talk quite different down in the South than you would if you ran into somebody from Boston, Massachusetts. My point is what one part of the American exceptionalism rather, is diversity. I know that kind of almost comes across as over the top, but we are a very diverse society, and one of the points that I want to press upon you is we've always been diverse. Why? To answer that question, I need to take you back thousands and thousands, really millions of years. The first key point of this lecture that I want you to be mindful of is the term Pangea. Now, Pangea is a geological term that geologists use to describe a point in time in the Earth's history, approximately 225 million years ago, where geologists believe that the Earth, all the land mass anyway, was at one point in time attached. Now, if you know anything about land structures and how mountains are formed, or various landscapes, you understand that these natural disasters, fires, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, the ice ages, for instance, they help to give us the world that we see all around us. But one thing that I need you to understand is the world looked very, very, very different hundreds of thousands of years ago than how we see it today. So anyway, we believe what happened over the course of time was you began to see these natural disasters, and these natural disasters helped to break what we think of as continents apart, and over the course of millions of years, really, continents began to drift further and further away, and what you get millions of years later is the world that we see. Now, you've got continents, and as you might imagine, people that were living in various points of those continents, once they began to break apart, began to drift apart from one another. And so once they got to their final destination points, you can also imagine that they were in very different climates. And over the course of thousands of years, just like the planet itself was evolving, we believe that human beings were evolving. In other words, people began to take on characteristics that we would refer to as racial characteristics. Skin color, the shape of your eye, the texture of your hair. All of this had to do with your living environment, which was an evolutionary process, which traces, some of its explanations back to this whole term Pangea. Okay? More of that to come later in the semester. But for the time being, I want to continue on with this point of Pangea, the idea that landmass was once upon a time connected. Another important term that I need you to be mindful of is the term Bering Strait. Now, to think about this term, I want you to think Alaska, right? Think about Sarah Palin, if you will. When Sarah Palin was running for vice president back in 2008, she said she could see Russia from her house in Alaska. Actually, that's true. There are points of Alaska where if you look to the east, you are able to see Eastern Asia or Russia. Now, Alaska is in the proximity of Eastern Asia, but again, we believe that there was once upon a time, there was a land bridge that connected Eastern Asia to what is now Alaska or North America. Now, you're talking about thousands of years ago, and we believe that not only was the water much shallower back then, the Pacific Ocean is what I mean, we also believe that it was much colder, and therefore a lot of this land was not really land at all. It was frozen tundra, it was ice, and therefore human beings and animals could walk back and forth. That is what we call the Bering Strait. It was a land bridge that connected Eastern Asia to North America, and that's how we believe the first migrants, if you will, to the Americas populated what we now refer to as the Western Hemisphere. And again, we're talking about tens of thousands of years ago. Now, we believe that these first inhabitants were essentially hunter-gatherers. They were following the wild game, to a lesser extent the fields, to greener pastures. Now, what happened really was two things. Over the course of time, and again, we're talking about thousands of years, the Earth began to warm up. When it warmed up, the ice melted, and when the ice melted, the sea levels rose. Long story short, what you have is the modern-day visualization of North America. But what that meant for those migrants was that they were cut off from what we call the Old World, Europe, Africa, the Middle East, for the better part of 3,000 or 4,000 years. Now, obviously, they're going to take on a lot different cultures, a lot different religions, a lot of different ways of living, and certainly they're going to look a lot different than people in the Old World. But it also meant that you're going to need a stable food source. So around about 9,000 years ago, we see evidence that these people began to cultivate animals and cultivate food crops. In other words, they began to farm. Now, over the course of time, what you begin to see are civilizations beginning to take root. One of my favorite history teachers of all time, all college, graduate school, high school, was a high school history teacher that used to say, history begins when man starts writing. I understand what he meant. What he meant was we can see recorded events, recorded lineages, things of that sort. I kind of think that history begins when man starts farming. Because what it says is you don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon. You're here for the long haul. You're here on a semi-permanent basis. Now, there's going to be two groups of the original inhabitants of the Americans, or Americas rather, that I want you to be mindful of. We'll talk about the next group in the second session, but for right now, I want to talk about Meso America. Now, first of all, Meso America, what you really mean is Central America, and really Mexico, the modern-day country of Mexico. That would be Meso America. And in this time period of pre-European contacts, you're talking about what was home to over 40 million, what we would call Native Americans. To the north, in what is present-day the United States and Canada, you've got 7 million people. So think about that for a minute. 40 million people versus 7 million people. Why are 40 million people concentrating themselves there in Central America? what is it about Central America that makes it more desirable than North America? Well, let's think about the environment, right? Think about the growing season in a place like Mexico City. Now compare and contrast that to Bemidji, Minnesota, where it's winter basically 9 months out of the year. Obviously, it's much easier to live and farm and survive in Central America because the growing season's longer. So that's going to be one of many differences between the peoples that would inhabit Meso America versus what you and I think of as North America. Again, more of that to come. But there's two Mesoamerican societies that I want you to be mindful of before I let you go. The first is going to be the Mayans. Now, when most Westerners think, and I'm talking about modern-day Westerners, think of Native Americans, first of all, they typically think of North American Native Americans. That's not a very accurate way of looking at native North America, primarily, as I just pointed out, because they did not represent the majority of the native indigenous peoples that were here when Europeans started showing up. And secondly, many Westerners kind of reduce Native Americans to stereotypes of unsophisticated, unrefined, naive, savage, almost, like people. Nothing could be further from the truth, especially if you're talking about the Mayans. There was a movie that came out relatively recently called 2012, and that year should stand out in many of your minds, considering, according to the Mayan calendar, that was the year that the Earth was supposed to end. Now, the Mayans had a very sophisticated, very accurate calendar in which they could predict a solar year up to within a minute's accuracy. I mean, think about that. They didn't have things like telescopes, let alone things like satellites, and they're predicting within a minute's accuracy of one solar year. That's a very advanced society. Well, what we believe is around about 700 years before current era, Mayan society began to take root, and it really began to take root in the southern part of what we call Central America. Think Guatemala or Peru. What I'd like you to know about the Mayans is they were great city builders. The capital city, for instance, Tikal, located in what is present-day southern part of Central America, was an enormous city, at least enormous by standards of Europe at the time. I mean, you're talking about maybe one or two cities in Europe that could rival it. But nonetheless, great city dwellers. Now, think about a city for just a moment. A city is essentially a population, whether you're talking about now, back then, or any time in between, is essentially a population that could not feed itself if it did not bring food in from the outside. Now, in order to do that, you're going to have a very stratified society. And what that's going to mean is you're going to have people that are working at the bottom levels of the society. You're going to have people that are managing the oversight of all this production. And of course, you're going to have your leaders that are calling the shots. So one of the things that I want you to understand about the Mayans is they're a highly, highly stratified society, meaning that they had a working class, they had what we would call a middle class, and of course they had an elite ruling class that was likened to the divinity. They were gods as far as the Mayans were concerned. My point with this, the Mayans had an awful lot more in common with the ancient Romans or the ancient Egyptians than they did with what many Americans, modern-day Americans, would call Indians, okay? Now, we're only beginning to understand ancient American societies, including the Mayans. Now, part of the reason for that is the age-old stereotypes and biases that Westerners have always had when it comes to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Let me give you an example. The Spanish were the primary European group to colonize Central and South America, and when they got here and they encountered the indigenous populations in those areas, they said, what you're looking at are naked heathen pagan savages. Really what they meant was they were not Christian, okay? And you're talking about a very highly religious time period on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So nonetheless, for hundreds of years, the Spanish just kind of reduced Mayan civilization, later Aztec civilization, as savagery. And then in the 19th century, things began to change. And part of the reasons that they began to change was the way that the Spanish were studying some of these ancient Mayan ruins. Now you think about a Mayan temple. There's writing on it. I mean, if you're following along with me, I want you to flip to that slide that says Mayan plates. Look at that plate there. The Palenque plate is what you're looking at. There's inscriptions on it. Do you see those inscriptions? Now flip back to the slide that says Study in Mayan Civilization. When the Spanish arrived and they saw these inscriptions and these sculptures and these artifacts, they simply assumed it was the savages decorating their temples because they believed in these false gods. Over the course of time, what Spanish scholars were able to do was decipher those inscriptions, and what they found was they weren't decorations at all. As a matter of fact, what they were was a writing form. Okay? If you think about Spanish or English or French or some of the other Romantic languages, you're talking about a phonetic language, meaning when you say a word, it's got a root, it's got a prefix, it goes back to the Latins, it goes back to the Romans, and really you sound out a word. Sounds in the English language are used to determine what you mean. Not all languages work like that. For instance, Mandarin Chinese is a representative language. You've got a symbol that represents a word. And so the Mayan language was very similar to Mandarin in the sense that it was representative. If you look at that little graph that I've got on that Studying Mayan Civilization, you'll have a good idea of what I'm talking about. So over the course of time, what the Spanish discovered with these codices was that, in fact, these plates and temples told the history of ancient Maya, which is why we know so much more today about Mayan civilization than what we did even 20 years ago. And it's my prediction that within the next 10 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, we will have radically different understandings of what ancient Maya was like and the Mayans themselves. My point, what I want you to understand is the Mayans were a very complicated, very complex, very diverse, and most importantly, very advanced civilization. I mean, if you want to put them next to the English, how the English were living during this particular time period, I mean, the English don't even get close to the ancient Mayans when it comes to the advancements in science, technology, and the understanding of the world. Now, like all good things, Mayan civilization came to an end. Around about 800 AD, in current era, we begin to see Mayan civilization going into decline. Why? Well, one of the reasons is climate change. I mean, if you're going to feed that many people, hundreds of thousands of people, obviously you're going to have to alter your environment, your living environment. And if you alter it to the point, and we're finding this out in the 21st century, if you alter it to a point, that's going to have an environmental impact. And the environmental impact that we believe was influencing Mayan civilization was drought. We believe that they went several decades without sufficient rainfall, which obviously had an impact on the ability to feed the society. We also believe that Mayan civilization suffered from an erosion of the economy. One of the things that the Mayans were really, really good at doing was trading, and we know this because there are things that are showing up in Mayan temples and Mayan ruins that were nowhere, close to being indigenous to that part of Central America. Anyway, over the course of time, more and more Mayans found themselves doing business with fewer and fewer Mayans, which undercut the middle class in Mayan civilization. But what really did in the Mayans was a recurring invasion of nomadic warrior-like people known as the Mexica. Now, as Westerners, we know the Mexica as the Aztecs, okay? Now, the Aztecs, as I've mentioned, were a nomadic, roaming people that we believe originated north of what you think of as ancient Maya. you think of that as Lake Texcoco. Okay. Now, the Mayans, what I'd like to point out, were a very, very warrior-like people, but they were also very advanced when it comes to their fighting techniques. The point that I'm really trying to make here is that if you wanted to compare them to a fighting force, ancient Rome would be a really good example. Anyway, over the course of time, it was the Aztecs that managed to conquer a lot of people, the Mayans included, parts of the Mayan civilization. Now, the thing that I'd like you to understand about the Aztecs, even though they were warriors, they weren't these thugs that didn't recognize a good thing when they saw it. What the Aztecs were able to do is blend Aztec culture with a lot of the other cultures that they encountered, including the Mayan culture. And I think about all the good attributes of Mayan culture, science and business and language. What the Aztecs did is they took that and they adapted it to their own surroundings to produce a highly civilized and advanced civilization of their own. What we call this is creolization. I mean, think about that word for a second, Creole. Many of you probably think of Louisiana and New Orleans in particular. Okay? All creolization means is a blending of cultures. And if you think about New Orleans, that's exactly what it is. It's got a blending of culture. It's a little bit Southern, it's a little bit French, it's a little bit Caribbean, it's a little bit everything. Okay? So anyway, that's essentially what the Aztecs are doing to Meso America. They're creolizing it. And you generally see a blending of Central American cultures under their reign. Okay? Now, the other thing I want you to understand about the Aztecs is they created a vast, vast empire. I mean, they conquered basically everybody around them. And as a matter of fact, the people that they could not conquer, they entered into alliances with, and eventually formed something called the Triple Alliance. So by the time that Cortez and the Spanish arrived on the North American mainland and eventually went to war with the Aztecs, virtually all of Meso America, the mainland anyway, was controlled by the Aztecs. And what they were doing was what empires have done to their subjects since the beginning of time. They were extracting wealth. I mean, that's the purpose of empire, is to extract wealth and funnel that wealth back to the mother country. It's not the Europeans that invented that. You know, it's been with us for a long, long time. Anyway, there were really two things that the Aztecs demanded from the people that were under their dominion. One was taxes. Now, I don't care if you're talking about the 21st century, the 19th century, you know, the 2nd century. Taxes have never been popular. Now, if you think about it, you're seeing all of your gold, all of your treasure going from your society into Aztec society. And by the time that the Spanish showed up, these taxes were quite burdensome to many Mesoamerican civilizations that were ruled over by the Aztecs. Resentment and frustration. The other thing that the Aztecs were demanding were young men and women to play a game that I like to think of as a combination of basketball and soccer. It was a game where you would try to kick a ball through a hoop, except that the stakes were really, really raised. I mean, even more than World Cup soccer raised. The winning team, you heard me right, the winning team would be sacrificed to the Aztec sun god. Now, why the winning team? Well, you don't want to sacrifice a bunch of losers. I mean, clearly they weren't even worthy to be on the same field as the people that had defeated them. So, it was a really big honor to be sacrificed to the Aztec sun god. Except that's not your god if you had to send your best and your brightest over to participate in these games. So my point in all of this is, between the human sacrifices and the taxes that were being extracted from the Aztec Empire, it caused a lot of resentment and a lot of hatred of the Aztecs in particular. Enter into the conversation a Spaniard by the name of Hernan Cortez. Cortez was the military commander that was commissioned by the Spanish crown to lead an expedition of the North American mainland. And when he showed up, with only 500 conquistadors, many of the Native American tribes that were not Aztec proper but were ruled over by the Aztecs welcomed him with open arms. Why? You've heard the expression, an enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine. Cortez had a translator that would later go on to become his mistress, a woman by the name of Malinali, and Malinali was fluent in the Aztec language, but she also spoke Spanish. And so when she would encounter one of these Native American tribes, she would explain, you should join up with us, and if you join us, we'll help you defeat the Aztecs. So an enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine. That's where I'm going to leave this lecture. And what I'm hopeful that you're able to come away with here is that whether you're talking about ancient Maya or ancient Azteca, you are talking about a highly sophisticated, advanced, complicated society that is much different than what we think of when we typically think of the term Native American today. Now, in this next segment, we're going to be talking about the native societies of North America, which, as you'll find out, are a lot different than the stereotypes that are normally attached to them, and also vastly different than the people of Meso America.